In Cape Town's Pollsmoor prison, new inmates face a choice that hasn't changed in over a century: join the numbers, pay them, or die. But this isn't just another prison gang. It's a criminal empire born in 1800s gold mines, armed with invisible Boer War rifles, and ruled by the ghost of a man named Nongoloza, who died in 1948, but whose law still determines who lives and who dies behind bars today. Nongoloza Mathebula was born in 1867, just as South Africa's mining boom was transforming the country into a battlefield between African laborers and colonial exploitation. By the late 1800s, he'd organized African miner outlaws on the Witwatersrand into a force called the Ninevites. Now, these weren't just bandits robbing for profit. Nongoloza proclaimed something far more dangerous. He based his movement on biblical rebellion, creating what he called Nineveh Law, an anti-colonial code that transformed crime into resistance. The structure he built was military: ranks, hierarchies, chains of command, everything you'd expect from an army, except this one operated in the shadows of Johannesburg's mine compounds and hill caves. His followers weren't just criminals, they were soldiers in an imaginary war against racial exploitation. By 1909, when authorities finally captured and imprisoned Nongoloza for life, his Ninevites numbered around 1,000 members. They controlled robberies across the hills surrounding Johannesburg, and more importantly, they'd created something that would outlive them all: a mythology. You see, Nongoloza didn't just organize crime, he gave it meaning. Every robbery became an act of rebellion. Every violent act against authority became righteous. This wasn't theft, it was reclaiming what colonialism had stolen. At least that's how the story went. And stories, especially in prison, have a way of becoming more real than reality itself. The man himself would die in prison in 1948, but by then, his creation had evolved far beyond anything he could have imagined. The Ninevites were no longer just a gang. They'd become a religion, complete with prophets, commandments, and blood sacrifices. And like many religions, they were about to split into denominations. Legend says it happened in a cave. Nongoloza and his men were arguing about what exactly depends on who's telling the story. Some say it was about strategy. Others claim it was about homosexuality in the gang. But the details matter less than the outcome. According to the mythology that every numbers member must memorize, Nongoloza kept 8 men with him. These became the 28s. His rival took 7 men, they became the 27s. A third group of 6 men called Izisebenzi became the 26s. Now you might think this sounds like fantasy. You'd be right. Scholars note these origin tales are partly apocryphal, but here's what makes the Numbers Gang different from your average prison crew. They know it's partly fantasy, and they don't care. The myth is the point. By the 1920s and 30s, this three-way structure had spread like a virus through South Africa's prison system. One researcher found that by the early 1930s, derivatives of the Numbers gangs had a presence in almost every prison in South Africa. Each faction developed its own specific role, its own identity, and most importantly, its own function in the prison ecosystem. The 26s became the businessmen. They smuggled contraband, tobacco, drugs, alcohol, cell phones, anything that could be sold. They avoided open violence, preferring to accumulate wealth through what they saw as cunning rather than force. The 27s took on the role of enforcers. They became the judges, the executioners, the ones who maintained gang law through blood. And the 28s? They were the warriors, the fighters, the ones who handled conflicts and, according to their code, protected weaker inmates, though their definition of protection would make most people's blood run cold. This wasn't random division of labor. Each gang developed elaborate justifications for their roles, tied back to Nongoloza's original teachings. They created a trinity of crime, each part essential to the whole, each claiming direct descent from the prophet himself. What started as a simple gang split had evolved into something far more complex, a complete social system designed to function inside South Africa's prisons. To become a number, you must first die. Not literally, though sometimes that happens too, but symbolically, the person you were before entering the gang must cease to exist. The initiation process can take weeks, sometimes months. First comes the vetting by existing members, called endodas. They test your commitment, your loyalty, your willingness to obey without question. Then comes the education. Initiates must memorize the gang's entire history, starting with Nongoloza's story. They learn the 12 points, commandments that govern behavior, though the exact content varies between the three gangs and remains secret to outsiders. Most importantly, they must master Sabella, a secret language mixing isiZulu, Xhosa, Afrikaans, and English. This pidgin dialect, with vocabulary borrowed from colonial contexts, allows members to communicate openly about crimes and orders without guards understanding. But knowledge isn't enough. Blood must be spilled. Sometimes it's the initiate's own blood, cut and mixed in ritual. Sometimes it's the blood of others. A common rite of passage involves attacking a prison guard, an act the gangs justify as maintaining their version of order. According to their logic, they're not committing assault, they're proving their commitment to a higher law, Nongoloza's law. The oaths are taken publicly, in front of the gang's parliament of elders. These veterans, often on parole or serving life sentences, interpret and enforce the code. They serve as judges in the gang's internal court system, where violations are met with extreme consequences. According to one study, punishments range from warnings to gang rape, bloodletting, and death. The 27s in particular embody the concept of blood. They're known as the executioners and disciplinarians who enforce all three gangs' laws. When someone breaks the code, talks to authorities, fails to pay tribute, shows disrespect, it's usually the 27s who carry out the sentence. They see themselves not as murderers but as instruments of justice, maintaining the sacred order Nongoloza established. Violence isn't just punishment in the numbers world, it's promotion. Each act of violence against authority or rival gangs can advance a member through the approximately 30 ranks that make up the gang hierarchy. The more blood on your hands, the higher you climb. It's a system where brutality becomes currency, where your willingness to kill determines your worth. After Nongoloza's death in 1948, something shifted in the geography of the numbers. While the gangs maintained their presence across South Africa, the Western Cape, and specifically Cape Town, emerged as their unofficial capital. Pollsmoor prison became the Vatican of this criminal religion, the place where gang law was interpreted, where the most powerful leaders held court, where the purest version of the numbers tradition supposedly survived. By the mid-20th century, Pollsmoor wasn't just a prison, it was a numbers-controlled state within a state. The gangs had created a complete parallel system. They ran their own economy, built on contraband and extortion. The 26s controlled the smuggling operations, bringing in tobacco, drugs, alcohol, cash, and eventually cell phones. They financed this through theft, fraud, and selling goods and services to other inmates. The gambling rackets belonged to them too. Card games, improvised roulette tables, dice, all run by the numbers, all generating income that was laundered through the prison's informal economy. But the real money came from extortion. New arrivals at Pollsmoor quickly learned the rules. You want a bed? Pay the numbers. You want to eat without harassment? Pay the numbers. You want protection from rape or violence? Pay the numbers, though sometimes they were the very ones you needed protection from. Human Rights Watch documented this system in detail. They reported prisoners having to buy beds or visitors' rights from the gangs. A newcomer might have all his belongings confiscated upon arrival, then be forced to pay tribute to get them back. The gang hierarchies determined everything: who got beds, who ate first, who could move freely, who lived in fear. The numbers didn't see this as exploitation. In their mythology, they were maintaining order in a chaotic environment. They were the real authority in a place where official authority had failed. Every payment extracted, every beating administered, every rule enforced. It was all part of Nongoloza's grand design, or so they claimed. One prisoner recalled paying dozens of cigarettes just for the right to eat in peace. Another described how refusing to cooperate meant complete isolation at best, systematic brutalization at worst. The choice was simple: join them, pay them, or suffer. There was no fourth option. Everything changed in the 1980s when Jackie Lante walked into prison. Lante wasn't just another criminal, he was a Cape Flats drug lord with deep pockets and deeper ambitions. The Americans gang he ran on the outside was flush with drug money, and Lante decided to use that wealth to buy something that had never been for sale before: membership in the numbers. Lante purchased his way into the 26s while incarcerated, becoming the first person to break the sacred initiation traditions. No memorization of history, no learning Sabella, no blood rituals, just cash. The old-timers were furious, but money talks louder than tradition, especially in prison. This single transaction marked the beginning of the end for the old numbers system. Suddenly, the ancient rule of die Vierhoeke, that the numbers operated only within the four corners of prison walls, began to crumble. Wealthy street gang leaders, especially from Cape Town, started buying prison ranks to protect their interests. The line between inside and outside began to blur. Street bosses needed protection when they got locked up. Prison leaders needed funding for their operations. It was a marriage of convenience that would transform both worlds. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the transformation was complete. Cape Flats kingpins weren't just buying membership, they were buying leadership positions, bypassing decades of what would have been required advancement through violence and loyalty. The sacred became profane. The spiritual became commercial. The impact was immediate and devastating to traditional numbers culture. Veterans watched as their carefully preserved rituals were abandoned for profit. Young street criminals arrived with more money than respect, more connections than commitment to the code. They brought with them the culture of the Cape Flats, flashier, more materialistic, less concerned with Nongoloza's mythology, and more interested in immediate power. The gangs started operating differently. Where once they'd maintained strict separation from street gangs, now there were hybrid organizations. Americans 26s, for instance, carrying the numbers identity into Cape Town's ships. The prison pipeline reversed. Instead of the numbers controlling what happened inside, street money began dictating prison politics. September 2023. Ralph Stanfield, known on the streets as Devil, gets arrested. He's not just any gangster. He's allegedly one of Cape Town's most powerful 28 street bosses. What happens next would have been unthinkable in Nongoloza's time. While on remand, Stanfield is rapidly inducted as a 28s in Dota, a full member, bypassing the entire traditional progression that should have taken months or years. News 24 reported this in 2025 as evidence of how completely the numbers have evolved, or devolved, depending on who you ask. Veterans who spent weeks memorizing the 12 points and learning Sabalawatch as newcomers achieve in days what took them years. The old guard calls these changes a corruption, claiming the traditions have become disfigured wreckages of their former glory. But here's the thing. The structure survives even as the substance changes. The Parliament of Elders still meets. The three-gang system still operates. Sabella is still spoken, even if fewer members bother to master it completely. The invisible Boer war uniforms are still worn, the imaginary 303 rifles still carried, even if the young members barely understand why. What's different is the synchronization between prison and street. Today in Cape Town, there are dedicated 26s, 27s, and 28 street crews. They wear their numbers identity openly, tattoo the gang numbers on their bodies, and conduct business that flows seamlessly between Pollsmoor and the Cape Flats. The prison street pipeline is now a superhighway. Modern operations blur every traditional boundary. Street crews generate income that funds prison operations. Prison leaders issue orders that are executed in townships. A dispute in Pollsmoor can trigger a shooting in Mitchell's Plain. A drug deal gone bad in Manenberg can result in a stabbing in the prison exercise yard. The new generation of numbers members are hybrids, part traditional gangster, part modern criminal entrepreneur. They invoke Nongoloza's name but operate like CEOs. They perform the old rituals but with one eye on their smartphones, coordinating drug shipments and hits through smuggled devices. Some veterans refuse to acknowledge these new members as true numbers. They argue that without the full initiation, without the suffering and sacrifice, without the deep understanding of Nongoloza's law, these are just criminals wearing numbers colors. But power doesn't care about purity. The new numbers control the drugs, the money, and increasingly, the violence that defines Cape Town's underworld. The evolution has created a monster even Nongoloza might not recognize. Where he preached anti-colonial resistance, however self-serving, the modern numbers preach nothing but profit. Where the original gangs maintained strict codes about civilian targets, today's numbers wage war in the streets with little regard for collateral damage. The mythology remains, but stripped of even its pretense of ideology. Yet perhaps this was always inevitable. A system built on violence and exploitation, no matter how elaborate its justifications, tends toward its basest form. The sacred stories, the invisible uniforms, the imaginary weapons, they were always just decoration on a fundamental truth: power through violence, wealth through crime. Today, Cape Town's authorities face an enemy they cannot defeat through conventional means. The numbers aren't just in the prisons, they are the prisons. They aren't just in the streets, they increasingly control them. Every arrested numbers member returns to Pollsmoor not as a prisoner, but as a soldier returning to base. Every released member carries the gang's influence back to the townships. The cycle seems unbreakable. Young men in Cape Town's poorest areas grow up knowing the numbers are one of the few paths to power and protection in their world. They enter the system either as willing recruits or as victims who must choose between membership and victimization. Once marked with the gang's tattoos, branded with their number, there's no leaving. Former members report that even attempting to quit means death. The gangs don't accept resignations. The South African government has tried various approaches. Increased sentences just mean more numbers members concentrated in prisons for longer. Transfers between facilities just spread the gang's influence. Crackdowns on prison contraband barely dent the smuggling operations. The occasional arrest of a street leader like Stanfield makes headlines but changes nothing fundamental. The structure simply promotes someone else. What makes the numbers particularly resistant to destruction is their dual nature. They're simultaneously a criminal organization and a cultural phenomenon. You can arrest gangsters, but how do you arrest a mythology? You can confiscate weapons, but what about invisible rifles? You can punish violence, but how do you punish an ideology that sees violence as righteousness? The Human Rights Watch noted that each rank in the numbers has specific hierarchical duties, and internal discipline is strictly maintained. This isn't chaos, it's organized crime in its most literal sense. The gangs provide structure in environments where the state has failed to maintain order. They offer belonging where society offers exclusion. They promise power to the powerless, even if that power comes through victimizing others. In 2025, researchers estimate the numbers' influence extends far beyond what official reports acknowledge. Their tentacles reach into corrupt prison officials who facilitate smuggling, police who tip them off about raids, and even legitimate businesses that launder their money. The gang that started in 1800s mine compounds has evolved into a multi-million rand criminal enterprise that South African authorities seem powerless to stop. Cape Town remains ground zero for this ongoing crisis. Pollsmoor Prison continues to serve as the numbers' headquarters, a fortress where gang law supersedes state law. The surrounding townships, Mitchell's Plain, Manenberg, Hanover Park, have become the gang's territories, places where the 26s, 27s, and 28s wage their wars with increasing boldness. The bodies pile up weekly. Sometimes it's internal discipline, a member who broke the code, someone who failed to pay tribute. Sometimes it's territorial, disputes over drug corners, conflicts over protection rackets. Sometimes it's seemingly random, initiates proving themselves, members climbing the ranks through blood. But it's never truly random. Every death serves the system somehow, advances someone's position, sends someone's message, enforces someone's will. What's most disturbing is how normalized this has become. Cape Town residents speak of numbers violence the way other cities speak of traffic, an unfortunate but inevitable part of daily life. Parents in affected areas teach their children to recognize gang tattoos, to know which territories belong to which numbers, to navigate the complex and deadly geography of gang control. The prison system, meant to rehabilitate, instead serves as a university for crime. Young men enter for minor offenses and emerge as initiated numbers members, trained in violence and connected to a criminal network that will define the rest of their lives. The recidivism rate isn't just high, it's essentially guaranteed. A numbers member leaving prison isn't being released, he's being deployed. Meanwhile, the mythology continues to evolve. Each generation adds its own chapter to Nongoloza's story, its own interpretation of his law. The invisible uniforms adapt. Some young members claim to wear modern military gear in their imagination, updating the Boer War aesthetic for the 21st century. The weapons evolve too, imaginary AK-47s joining the Phantom 303 rifles. But at its core, the system Nongoloza created remains remarkably intact. 3 gangs, each with its role. A hierarchy based on violence, a code that places gang law above state law, a mythology that transforms criminals into soldiers, crimes into battles, murder into justice. The South African government's latest response has been to propose maximum security units specifically for numbers leaders, attempting to isolate them from the general population. But history suggests this will fail like every other attempt. The gangs have survived colonialism, apartheid, and democracy. They've adapted to every change in the prison system, every new security measure, every attempted reform. Because ultimately, the numbers gang isn't just a criminal organization, it's a solution to a problem. As long as South African prisons remain overcrowded, underfunded, and brutal, inmates will need protection. As long as Cape Town's townships remain poor, violent, and neglected, young men will need belonging and purpose. As long as the state fails to provide security and opportunity, the numbers will fill that vacuum. Nongoloza has been dead for 77 years, but his ghost still rules Cape Town's underworld. The Ninevites he organized in the 1800s have become something he probably never imagined: a permanent criminal state within a state, an invisible empire that controls visible lives, a mythology that murders in reality. The question isn't whether the numbers gang will survive. They've already proven they can outlast governments, survive reform attempts, and adapt to any challenge. The question is whether South Africa can survive them, because every year their influence grows. Every year, more young men swear blood oaths to a dead prophet. Every year, the invisible empire becomes more visible, more violent, more impossible to ignore. In Cape Town tonight, in Pollsmoor prison, and in the townships that surround it, the ritual continues. New initiates are learning Nongoloza's story, memorizing the 12 points, practicing Sabella. They're putting on their invisible uniforms, picking up their imaginary rifles, preparing for a war that's been raging for over a century. A war between the living and the dead, between the real and the imagined, between order and chaos. And tomorrow, when the sun rises over Table Mountain, the counting will continue. 26, 27, 28. The numbers that rule South Africa's underworld, the mathematics of murder, the arithmetic of empire. Nongoloza's children, still fighting his war, still following his law, still building his kingdom, one body, one payment, one blood oath at a time.